Hi everyone. I'm sorry we're all missing each other in person tonight, but I wanted to go through a few ideas about character and dialogue. These are two really important um, things that you can use when you're creating your pieces, and it's really important that we have a good, strong sense of what these are, because I know we're not doing craft readings per se in this class. We're just kind of doing it ad hoc as we go along. So I wanted to make sure you have a clear understanding of character and dialogue and how you can use them when you are creating your own creative pieces. So the information that we're going to be talking about tonight comes from mostly from Janet Burroway's imaginative writing that I've been using throughout this semester. And before we get started, I just want you to think for a minute about good techniques and guidelines that writers use when creating dialogue and character, things that you have witnessed in some of your favorite literary works. And when you think about your favorite pieces of literature, most of the time these are memorable because of the characters and because of the way the characters are brought to life on the page. So if you want to pause and think for a few minutes, I'm not going to stop my narration, but if you want to pause and think for a few minutes about some of your favorite pieces, how those characters are presented, how they're brought to life. And those are some of the things we're going to be talking about here. So when you're using character in writing, there are a number of different ways you can reveal those people and what they're like to your readers. And the first one is the one we have been talking about most in this class, and it's really the foundation of all creative writing, and that idea of image that we started with the very first night of class. So those strong sensory details that bring people, places, everything to life on the page for your readers in lieu of a direct pathway to the emotions, which writers don't have. Remember, we talked about that the first night. The other arts, visual arts, music, dance, all of the other arts you can think of have a direct pathway to the senses, and we have to compensate for that as writers. So when you're putting your character on the page, you want to think about how everything that you possibly can to appeal to the senses. How does the person laugh? What are they wearing? How do they move? What gestures do they make? What objects do they carry? What do they eat and drink? How do they speak? What's the tone of their voice? The texture of their skin? The smell of their hair? And when we're creating character on the page, we like to keep in mind something that's called the iceberg theory. And you'll hear this a lot probably if you continue with creative writing. And the idea is that what we see on the page is only the tip of the iceberg, only the top of the iceberg that's floating above the water, which is about 10%. The rest of the 90% is buried underneath the water. We don't see it, but the author knows about it. So even if these details here, for example, how the person laughs, the texture of the skin, the smell of the hair, even if these things are not coming across directly on the page, you need to know what they are, and you need to have a sense of what those are in your mind about your character. Voice and speech are another method that you can use to bring a character across on the page. And it's really important to be able to hear your character's voice in your head. A lot of writers like to have conversations with their characters. Probably better not to do this in public or people will think you're crazy, but I've been known to talk to myself in public and I don't really care what people think. But if that's going to bother you, find a nice quiet space where you can imagine a conversation or even actually talk to your characters out loud. Imagine what they would say. Some writers try writing a monologue in their character's voice, and this is an exercise that I've tried before too. It actually works really well, especially if you're having a hard time capturing a character's voice. Start writing as if you were that character and keep going until you catch their voice, and eventually you will. It's really, really important to have a solid grasp on how your character speaks so that comes across for your readers. Action is the third method that you can use to develop characters for your readers. The way characters act in and respond to the world tells us so much about them, as you know from your own personal interactions in real life. You put your characters in action by letting them grow and discover, by letting them make tough decisions. These things both force states of action. And the famous playwright Sam Smiley says that any significant discovery forces change in conditions, relationships, activities, or all three. And the quickest and best way to know someone is to see that person make a significant decision. At the instant a character makes a choice, he or she changes from one state to another. Her significant relationships alter, and usually she must follow a new line of action as a consequence. So, putting your characters in action, having them make a significant decision, is a really great way for you to bring them to life for your readers. The fourth method is thought. Modern fiction almost always uses limited, omniscient perspective, almost always goes into the mind of at least one main character. Poetry, of course, can go into anyone's mind, it feels like. Characters in drama sometimes will let us know what they're thinking by breaking what we call the fourth wall. When we say the fourth wall, we mean the audience. They sometimes break the stage presence itself and speak directly to the audience. We usually trust them when they do this, not always. The only place where we don't necessarily hear other people's thoughts, we'll hear the speaker's, the narrator's thoughts, is in nonfiction, the personal essay. It's not really, we don't usually believe it. You break credibility if you start telling us what other people around you think. Now, there are exceptions to this, and Catherine Boo's Beyond the Beautiful Forevers, I highly recommend it. It's nonfiction, and she actually does go into the minds of different characters simply because she lived with these people for 5 years and spent so much time talking with them. And so it is possible in nonfiction to go into a variety of different people's minds, but typically that's reserved for fiction, poetry, and drama. The fifth way you can use to get your characters on the page is through indirect telling and authorial interpretation. This can be useful if used sparingly because it can get a large amount of information across really quickly. And some authors also will use it, you'll see, to create irony or distance. But it keeps us from having the experience ourselves of the characters. And as we've been discussing, we'll continue to discuss throughout the class, it's extremely important that we show, not tell, for our readers, so that we are creating an experience for our readers, not telling them what to think. They come to their own conclusions. And so when you tell your readers what to think of your character or present them through your own interpretation, rather than letting them act, speak, and describe them so that your readers can see them for themselves, you're keeping your readers from having that experience and from really getting to know those characters themselves. A few more important things to think about in terms of character. The first one is motivation or desire, and this is the driving force behind all of us. And it's really, really important that every character you create, every major character, have some kind of longing, hope, need. What is it that this person can't live it without? And this kind of need, this kind of desire is always going to manifest itself in situations. It's going to manifest itself in image and action. But it's really important, just like the iceberg theory, it's really important that you know, even if that you don't tell us, your readers, exactly what that desire is. It's important that you know what is driving your character so that you can bring that across clearly in their behavior and their appearance. We're going to talk more specifically about the large idea of conflict in narrative when we talk about story and plot next week or the following. But when we talk about conflict in terms of character, it's a really useful tool that you can use to create interesting characters who are going to be motivated, who are going to be driven on the page. So think for a minute, you've got a polished, well-spoken, perfectly dressed business executive who thinks in a very orderly and determined manner, very, professional man. This is not a very interesting character. It's probably what we call a stock character, a flat character. Nothing that we don't already suspect is going to happen to this person or in this person's life. But if you think for a second, if this person's mind becomes a mess of fear and insecurity, then suddenly you have this character who is in conflict with himself. He's got this polished exterior and this mental madness that he's dealing with. And then things are going to start to happen. So keep conflict in mind as you're putting your characters together. The other thing that we're going to be talking about tonight is dialogue. And these ideas, again, come from Janet Burroway, and they also come from Heather Sellers. She's got a book called The Practice of Creative Writing. It's a really wonderful book. I have a copy if you're interested. But dialogue is something that's used often in connection with characters. It's one of the main ways that you can demonstrate characters for your audience. It's also in drama, it is like Wit, the play that we read for tonight, it is the major form that everything is told. Okay, everything in a drama happens through dialogue. Now, it's really tricky to use dialogue effectively because it has to seem like real speech, but it can't actually be real speech because real speech is pretty boring. Robert Boswell says we speak about 3,000 or so lines of dialogue every day, but only about 20 of them are worthy of being recorded. Okay, so when you're creating dialogue, you want it to sound real, but you want it to do a heck of a lot more work and be a heck of a lot more interesting than real speech. When we're talking about drama, dialogue is always direct. It's spoken directly by the characters. And as I said before, it is the main way we get information in a play. But in other types of writing, you can summarize less compelling conversations for the reader to speed things up. And you'll notice fiction writers do this often. In nonfiction, it's tricky. There's no way you're going to remember exactly who said what, exactly the lines that were said. And your readers are going to realize that. They're going to know that you are doing your best to recreate that conversation faithfully, as faithfully as you can. So we've been talking a little bit about emotional truth in here. And this is when you're creating dialogue in nonfiction, emotional truth is really important. You want to be true to the emotional essence of the conversation. You're not going to get it word for word as it happened. And even if you did, it might be too boring to put it word for word on the page. So, like appearance, speech is voluntary, but it tells a lot about us. And talking sometimes, you know this from your personal experience, when people talk, they often reveal things about themselves. They betray things about themselves that they may not mean to. So when characters speak in writing, we need them to advance the plot, to fill in the past, to control the pace, to establish the tone, to foreshadow the future. Okay, these are all things that dialogue can do for you. This is a lot of work. So that's why we want to be really careful when we're creating dialogue on the page. Try to hear your characters' voices if you can. Try not to force them to say things they wouldn't normally say just to get a point across. Take dictation from your characters. Write monologues in their voice to hear what they might say. And listen to them. Let them surprise you. So here's an example. If a character says something like, I feel that civilization is encroaching on nature and that the greed of the developers will diminish the value of all our lives, said Janine. I'm not sure I believe someone would really say that. And if that person really does say that, I'm not sure I really want to hear that person or get to know that person very well. Here is another example of how you might get exactly the same idea across in much more concrete terms that are much more like real speech. They should lock up that builder, said Janine. He's massacred the neighborhood. I remember how the lilac and wisteria used to bloom, and then the peonies and the daffodils. What fragrance in this room. But now, smell the stink of that site next door. It makes me sick. So again, you are likely going to want the speech of your characters to accomplish major work for your writing. But think about keeping it realistic. Think about keeping it concrete. Think about what your characters would actually say. So we discussed ideas of growth and discovery in relation to character. And if dialogue contains movement, change, and action, where characters are making discoveries and decisions, it's going to be a lot more powerful and a lot more interesting. So, dialogue is really great for those moments where you want to slow things down, show us the tension, the emotions of your